Hello and welcome to the Oxford University Linguistics Society event for week 6. We are here with Professor John Goldsmith, who is the Edward Carson Waller Distinguished Service Professor of Linguistics and Computer Science at the University of Chicago and a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. You might know him from his work in autosegmental phonology, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. We're going to be talking about that as well as the development of generative grammar, machine learning, and if we've got some time left, some more recent work about abstract concepts behind our use of language. So yeah, Selena, if you'd like to start with the first question.
Brilliant. So our first question is about your most recent book, co-written with Bernard Lux at the University of Paris, Battle in the Minefields, which is broadly about the history of some of the ideas in modern linguistics. And you've spoken a bit about rethinking where generative grammar came from. And we were hoping you could tell us a bit about how you see the origins of generative grammar, what it is, and what makes it distinct from earlier traditions in linguistics.
Yes. Well, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation to talk with you, and I'm really delighted to have this chance. And that book, Battle in the Minefields, which I wrote with Bernard Lux, is really the center of sort of where my imagination and thought is these days. It came out in English in 2019, and there's a French version which is close to being out. It's all edited and done and all, and it'll hopefully be out in the bookstores in September. So that work that I'm very much taken by is really about the origin of thought and how it is that linguistics as a profession, not as individuals, but as a group, as a discipline, how we learn and how we forget things. And the project that led up to this book really began in conversations that Bernard and I had starting 25 years ago. And part of our conversations seemed to center about the fact that there was a lot about the history of our discipline that we didn't know. And there was a lot about the history of our discipline that it seemed to have been misrepresented in the histories that each of us had sort of internalized just by virtue of being in the profession. So we more and more wanted to understand, why do we understand our backgrounds so poorly, and what are the consequences of this for us linguists as a discipline? And the more that we got into it, the more we thought about it, the more, well, this is my formulation of it, the more I realized that a discipline consists of a set of questions. You know, the positivist view about science is that it's a collection of results, of statements that hopefully are true, that tell us something about the real world. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. But at the same time, and probably more importantly for those of us who are actually doing science, and that includes everybody at every stage in their career, what's at least as important and perhaps more are the questions that we're asking. And as we look at changes in a field over time, or comparing different approaches to phonology, syntax, linguistics as a whole, the differences that we see are typically not so much disagreements about what the correct answer is to a question that we share, but it's rather disagreements as to what questions are interesting, are important, and what work in the past needs to be brought in. And so, you know, these are questions for which nobody's really very well prepared. And yet they seem extremely important to me. So you asked the question about generative grammar in particular. I'd like to say that I am not focused only on generative grammar. The Battle in the Minefields basically goes back to around the beginning of the 19th century, because that's when modern Western linguistics began. And we trace the first 3 generations of linguists in the 19th century and then go on into the succeeding generations in the 20th century as well. And generative grammar is rooted in so many philosophical, psychological, logical traditions. And I think it's necessary to bring them out. I also think that if I look at my colleagues in the United States today, members of the LSA, people giving talks and writing books and so forth. I think generative grammar has become very much a minoritarian view. The central idea behind generative grammar, I would pick the following as the central idea, what motivated Chomsky in the late 50s into the 60s and for the rest of his career, is the question, what can we learn about language if we want to model it as a kind of knowledge that involves no subjectivity whatsoever? You know, when Chomsky started talking about his idea of generative grammar, he said, you know, grammarians in the past haven't really lived up to the standard that I want to apply, and that is, grammarians typically depend on some kind of not very clear understanding on the part of the reader, the person who's reading the grammar. And he says, let's stop that. Let's make it all fully explicit and see how far we can get. And he spent quite a bit of time chastising former linguists for, you know, having leaned on the subjective expectations of linguists. He says, no, let's make it all formal. And certainly I found that very exciting, and so did many other people at this time. It didn't occur to me then, well, why? Why exactly should that be the question to ask? What's unreasonable about asking this, you know, having grammars that do indeed rely on the subjective understanding of the reader? And that's just one question, but it's a really big and good question. Why did generative grammar, and why does it still think that that's the fundamental, the central question that drives the way generativists do grammar? So that's a longish answer to your question, but I'm trying to give an answer to why is it that I want to go back and re-ask these questions myself, along with Bernard, and hopefully with other readers who will join us in this exploration.
Actually, we'd like to press you a little more on that. If you could also talk some more about what generative grammar is, sort of more specifically, what about its sort of formal apparatus gives it that objectivity you talked about, or at least is heading in that direction. But also what this sort of thing that you've pointed out its importance, but it's not something a lot of scientists are always keen to do, to look back and sort of self-reflectively on their own field. What kind of thing has that taught us about linguistics then?
Boy, I really think it's taught me a huge amount, and I think it's really changed the way I think about the profession. So you've asked two really tough questions, and very, very different ones. So the first is more about the commitment to these questions by people who view themselves as generative grammarians on the one hand, and then the other is, why is it that scientists, will include linguists among these, why is it that scientists, for the most part, don't really go in for that kind of reflection, especially historical reflection? So two different questions, and I'll try to answer them. The first question is really hard because you're, as you said, you want to push me a little bit on what's generative grammar, and that's perfectly fine to push me. I'm happy to be pushed in that way, but the term has been used in so many different ways, and it's really quite difficult to answer the question unless we settle on what we mean by generative grammar. So for myself, when I say something about generative grammar, I'm thinking of purely formal linguistics as it was developed by Noam Chomsky at some point in his career. You know, there are other people who've developed very formal linguistics. You know, you could take categorical grammar, for example, which is pre-Chomskyan, not indebted to Chomsky. It's a purely formal approach, which has its roots. Now, this is the other John Goldsmith who's going to jump in for a moment. Categorical grammar has its roots in the work of Edmund Husserl, a very important philosopher around the beginning of the 20th century, about whom I knew almost nothing, I should say, before writing Battle in the Minefields, and who now I understand to be a very important and influential, a great influence in linguistics. Anyway, categorical grammar, based on ideas of Husserl, developed by Polish logicians, and then any number of other grammarians and logicians since, no, is not built on Noam Chomsky's work in any way. And so I wouldn't call it generative grammar, even though Chomsky has himself defined generative grammar as any grammar that's purely formal and doesn't involve the subjective understanding on the part of the linguist. So when I use the term generative grammar, I'm trying to combine those two things, sort of the content, intellectual content on the one hand, and then understanding that it really is connected to this one, amazing guy, Noam Chomsky, who, but on the other hand, he has obviously changed his mind over the many decades that he's been doing linguistics. So it is true that I think our understanding of generative grammar is modified, is influenced by going back and looking at the history. I've become utterly fascinated by studying the work of Zelig Harris. And Harris is known for a bunch of things in linguistics. I think he was one of the great linguists in the middle of the 20th century. Among the American linguists of that time, there was, I think, Zelig Harris and Charles Hockett and Kenneth Pike, who were really the intellectual leaders at that point. But he's probably better known. Zelig Harris is probably better known as having been Noam Chomsky's teacher. And in many ways, Chomsky was obviously very influenced by him. Chomsky got his early ideas of what linguistics could be and should be by studying with Harris and by reading this book that Harris spent a number of years writing, which was published under the name Methods in Structural Linguistics. So I think it's impossible to understand Chomsky's, both his questions and his answers, unless you read Zelig Harris and say, oh, wow, well, that's where that idea came from. I'm still discovering things that kind of blow my mind by going back and reading carefully works by Zelig Harris and other people of his time. I would say too, I don't know if you've looked at it, I posted a couple of videos, and there's one very long video about the origins of generative grammar. And I talk a lot in that video about the connections between questions that were being asked by the Vienna Circle. These are people like Rudolf Carnap and Yehoshua Bar Hillel, who was not himself a member of the Vienna Circle. He was too young, but he was very influenced by Rudolf Carnap. And when Carnap left Central Europe because of the rise of Hitler, Carnap came to the United States, and later Bar Hillel came and worked with Carnap for a while. Then Bar Hillel became really good friends with Chomsky, and in any event, the influence of Carnap and other people in the Vienna Circle on the rise of generative grammar is pretty clear and quite interesting. So that may be part of where your question is coming from.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. And for people who are listening in the future to our talk, we'll make sure that your videos on these topics are linked below, and then people can go and watch those as well and find out more information. A little bit of promotion here going on. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually. And I think obviously for people like myself and Mal, who are obviously relatively very new to linguistics, it's very interesting to hear about the long history that we only tend to get a bit of a snapshot about. So that's really fascinating. And a lot of those names, I must admit, I've never heard of. So it's like, oh, okay, that's a note to self, that'd be a good thing to look at. So our third question centers around, one of the pieces of work that you're most famous for, autosegmental phonology. And I think for a lot of people who see your name will think automatically the connection there. And so we'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about autosegmental phonology and how it is represented, how it represents a break from what had come beforehand. So again, kind of looking at that historical connection.
Yep. Great. Yeah, it still amazes me that people associate my name primarily with autosegmental phonology, and certainly there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely. It's not what I mostly think about these days, and haven't in quite a while. But yeah, so let me give you a kind of a personal, start off with at least a personal side to that story. I went to grad school at MIT in 1972, and At the time, it was a 4-year program. Everybody finished in 4 years. And at the beginning of your second year, around November of your second year, you had to submit 2 research papers. We call them generals papers. And one had to be in syntax, one in phonology. And I was interested in syntax at the time. I thought I knew a lot. Maybe I didn't. And I knew nothing about phonology. And I had a hard time finding a topic. I went to Morris Halley. He gave me one topic on vowel harmony. I got nowhere with it. I went back and said, I got nowhere with this. And he gave me a dissertation that had just come in from Will Laban, who was Halley's student as well. And Will had left MIT. He was teaching out at Stanford, I think, already. I read the dissertation, and it was on African tone language. And I thought, wow, this is really great. Interesting questions, interesting data, questions that hadn't been answered still. And so I wrote a paper and submitted it like everybody else. All of the second year students submitted it in November, and they failed me on it. They, got an F or whatever. Said, no, not good enough. And so that was kind of disappointing. And, but they didn't kick me out. They gave me, I don't know, 6 months or 9 months, whatever, time to rewrite it. And so I buckled down. I got a grammar of Igbo by Green and Igwe, Margaret Green, and wrote a much better paper, and they accepted it. And, at that point, people got really excited about this autosegmental framework. So I kept on working on it, and I did a dissertation on it. Honestly, in a way, it wasn't really where the heart of the soul of my interest was in linguistics, but it was cool. It was interesting. It was great to work with other people. So now you ask the question, how did that work relate to what had gone on in the past? And it's such a complicated question. I had no idea at the time how complicated a question was. So one answer is already implicit in what I just said to you, Green and Igwe. I said, oh, so I went and got a grammar. They flunked me on this paper, so I felt bad. Went and got Green and Igwe. It's like, well, how did Green and Igwe save me? Who are they? Well, Margaret Green was a student of British linguistics. She studied prosodic analysis. She worked with the Igwe. They wrote a brilliant grammar of Igbo. And I just used this as raw material, as grist for my mill, without thinking about the decades and decades of time and labor and intellectual capital that lay inside that. And many traditions of linguistics do that as well, sort of mindlessly take advantage of the work that goes into grammar. So that's one thing. And the only paper I've ever published in the Journal of Linguistics, the LAGB journal, was I think in 90 or 1991. And it was about this. It was about genealogical traditions and how important linguistic ideas spread from one theoretical framework to another through areal linguistics. And when I say areal, I mean like African linguistics. So I was working on African linguistics at this point. And so I read this grammar by Green and Igwe. And although they came from a different theoretical framework, their ideas obviously flowed into what I was doing on autosegmental phonology. And I didn't have to worry about it. Anybody who goes to a meeting on Germanic linguistics, African linguistics, sign language linguistics, you don't have to apologize or defend the theoretical framework you're coming from because, hey, we're all people who love African languages or whatever the group is. And that's really, really important. And it's the most important way in which ideas are spread through linguistics. So that's one thing. A second thing is this. So not too long before I finished my dissertation, but I know I had already had it typed up because, well, you'll see in this story. I was talking with Morris Halley, who was my advisor, and he said, John, you will need to write something in your dissertation to show how what you're saying here is different from the work of Zelig Harris, Bernard Bloch. I don't know, he mentioned maybe one or two other people. And I'd like to say I'd heard of all these people, hopefully I had, I don't know, but certainly I hadn't ever read anything by them. And certainly I didn't think that they had anything that was worthy of me going out of my way to read them. So I did, though, and I wrote a short chapter on them in my dissertation. And the reason I know the rest of the dissertation was done because I didn't have a number left for a chapter. So I called it chapter 0. In any event, and what I discovered was, hey, he's absolutely right. I really did need to, I really did see lots of parallels between what I was doing and the work that had come before. And it took quite a few years for that idea to kind of filter in there. But I'll mention a couple of relevant cases, relevant things. So a few years later, I started reading work by Charles Hockett, and I discovered there was lots of roots of autosegmental and metrical phonology in the work that he was doing. And I wrote a bit about this in a book I published in 1990 called Autosegmental and Metrical Phonology. And later I learned, just sort of by random accidents here and there, how shocked so many people were that I had done that in a pretty widely read book talking about how Charles Hockett laid some foundations for work that was being done in a generative framework. And now I see continuity. I mean, I see generative grammar as it was developed in Sound Pattern of English by Chomsky and Halley, really as a development of Sapir and that is the work of Edward Sapir and Zelig Harris. Of course, there's lots of improvements and advances and fallbacks and all those things, but it really is a matter of intellectual continuity and progress rather than generative phonology just having appeared out of nowhere. Absolutely. As long as I'm on it, I'll just mention, I just finished a paper looking at a part of Zelig Harris's phonology that I had really never studied before. And I realized that he hated Trubetskoy and Jakobson's idea about features in phonology. And the reason he hated them was really very simple. And that was he thought that phonetics had no role to play in linguistics. He thought that distribution was everything, which means basically if you're going to study phonology, figure out what the phonemes are, figure out what order they can appear in, and things of the sort. And phonetics should play no role in that. And he had his reasons for that, and they were based on his understanding of science in part. And so he ended up constructing a new concept of feature, but he didn't call them features, but they were based on what sounds can appear next to one another, as opposed to what? And after reading Harris, what I realized was that the Trubetskoy concept of features, which is what ultimately Halley and Chomsky employed, is a set of features that are used to describe differences between sounds in a way that Saussure would have called in absentia. That is to say, you study something in absentia if you study inventories. So, inventory of vowels in your language, or consonants, or nouns, or verbs, or tenses, whatever. You study the system. So it's you study all the possibilities at one time. You look at the differences, and that's how phonology, as was developed by Trubetskoy and Jakobson and Halley, and then Chomsky. I'm thinking of that as a chain of people who influence each other. And Harris had a different idea, and that was to come up with a language-specific analyses in which we could break apart segments into pieces. He didn't call them atoms, but they very much remind me of the concept of atoms in government phonology, for example. The work of Jean-Louis Vigneault and Jonathan Kay and Harry Vanderhulst and people like that. And so this is one of the things that Harris came up with, and it was just really interesting for me to go back and reread Harris and see what he was developing and understand why, and compare it to one of the developments in phonology that people are working on today. So that's a longer and I hope more concrete answer to your question.
So to move topic a little bit, some of your more recent work has been on machine learning and morphology. Could you tell us a little more about this and what you think it has told us or will tell us about language?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll begin with a kind of a personal note. It's a little bit like my story about where autosegmental phonology came from. In the 90s, just after I finished that book that I mentioned before on autosegmental and metrical phonology, I wasn't terribly thrilled with the direction that phonology was taking at that point. So I was looking for something else to do in linguistics, something that would really, I don't know, grab my attention, make me feel like I was accomplishing something of some value. And I was hanging out with a lot of computational linguists at the time because that was what my wife was doing, and I thought it was interesting. And so I was talking with a bunch of people who worked on Asian languages, and as you probably know, in quite a number of Asian languages, there's no overt marking of the beginning and the end of a word. So you have the problem of, some people call it word segmentation or word breaking. And I got interested in the problem, and somebody told me to read a recent dissertation by Carl de Marken, who had been a student at MIT in computer science. And he proposed a method to use a framework I'd never heard of called minimum description length. And it was based on information theory, about which I knew absolutely nothing. The only thing I knew about information theory was that anybody who knew anything about language knew that it had it was of no use for treating language, which I've subsequently come to realize is completely false. But so somebody pointed me to that dissertation, and I read it, and I realized he really knew a lot about language, even though he was just a computer scientist. I said, I got to understand this, because he's doing something pretty magical here. So his task was take a long string of segments in which there are no boundaries between the words, and reverse engineer the language, figure out what are the words. That's essentially what a child does in some fashion. And he wanted to do it in a purely formal way with no access to meaning, just because he had no access to meaning. And I found this fascinating. I learned an enormous amount by following his footsteps here. And I said, okay, well, this is great. When I figured I had learned everything I could from it, I then asked myself, well, what's the next step? And it seemed clear that, so he had an algorithm which would take this long text and it would spit out what the words are in this language. And of course, it wasn't always right. Sometimes what it thought was a word was a part of a word. And sometimes it was, like, for example, government. It would come out as two words, govern and meant. Sometimes it would be multiple words, like United States of America. Sometimes it would be things that were neither the one nor the other, like ED followed by THE. It would always grab that as a word because it has a very high frequency of occurrence. And while frequency isn't everything, it plays a major role. So I said, well, the major problem for his system is that we haven't endowed it with any understanding that language has hierarchical structure. There are pieces smaller than words. There are lots of things bigger than words. How do we tell this poor learner, this formal learner, that it shouldn't just be fixated on one level of finding pieces that have no internal or external structure? How do we do that? And I said, okay, well, syntax, that's the hierarchical structure above the word. That's hard. That's really, really hard. So let's just work on morphology. And I thought I would work on morphology for 5 years. And this was 1997. And I thought it couldn't take all that long to figure out how to automatically learn morphology. And now 23, 24 years later, I'm still working on it. But once again, I would say doing this work, following the ways in which information theory and then description length helped me to reformulate ideas in linguistics. To me, it just completely changed the way I understand linguistics. And it helped me much better understand one of the fundamental ideas about generative grammar. So let's go back. Let me give you another answer to that question about generative grammar. I gave you one answer before, and I won't go back on it, which was generative grammar just assumes that we've got formal grammars which don't use the subjectivity of don't appeal or don't depend on the subjective understanding of the linguist who's reading the analysis. Okay, but there was a much more interesting idea, much more substantive idea that Chomsky was developing in the late 50s and really up until, at some level, up until the late 70s. And this was the idea that he called an evaluation metric. So he had this idea that if you develop a theory of grammar for any given set of data, there's going to be many ways of analyzing it. Potentially, there could be an infinite number of ways of analyzing data if all you had was the technology to write a grammar. So what's the upshot of that? What do you do if you are a grammar, a person who's going to construct the theory of grammar, as Chomsky was, and you realize that given any set of data, you're going to have an infinite number of grammars that are consistent with that data? Well, so Chomsky said, well, this is not a situation which is without precedent. What we need is an evaluation metric. And what that'll be is a way of looking at the data and at, well, let's do it this way. We look at two different analyses and we'll have a formal way for determining which of the two is a better way to account for the data. And in this, he was, I don't want to say responding to, but he was influenced by, and the work of many people. The first and most prominent was Nelson Goodman, who was a philosopher. He was one of Chomsky's teachers at Penn. Goodman taught at Penn for a while in the 40s, and then he moved up to Harvard, to where he had gotten his PhD. But people who are working in the philosophy of science in the context of the Vienna Circle, people who were influenced by Rudolf Carnap and others, were thinking about this problem. They were, in fact, thinking a lot about the way in which probability could be used as a tool to answer this question. And when I say this question, I mean, what do you do about the overabundance of grammars consistent with your theory, but also consistent with all the data you've got? So Chomsky came up with this idea, an evaluation metric, and his idea was that given a finite set of data, find all the grammars consistent with it, and then develop an evaluation metric, which would essentially be a way of calculating the complexity of a grammar and choose the least complex grammar. The work that I mentioned before that Carl DeMarkin developed on word discovery, I used the phrase minimum description length. And that's a framework that was developed by a Finnish-American statistician named Jorma Rissanen. And it brings together two things, and it uses information theory. One of the things it uses is the probability of a set of data given a grammar, and the other is the complexity of a grammar. And as I got into this, I came to the realization, the understanding that what MDL, that's short for minimum description length, what MDL employed as its concept of the length of a grammar, that was exactly what Chomsky was trying to develop in the 50s and 60s, this notion of an evaluation metric. But Chomsky couldn't get his system to work because he didn't have the idea of the probability of data given the grammar. And so MDL really was, it was the next step. It was what Chomsky would have done if he had decided to really plow forward with that, what seemed to me the central idea. So again, a long answer to your kind of two-pronged question. But the short answer then is, wow, reading all this work by people doing machine learning, and for me, the most influential was the people who were thinking about minimum description length and ideas like that. That encouraged me to go back and rethink everything I knew about linguistics and look at it in a new way.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you. I mean, you're apologizing for long answers, but that's what we're here for. We really like it. I was wondering actually if I could ask you a little bit more about the machine learning and morphology. And so obviously, you know, a lot of us listening, we're talking very much about the theoretical side of language. We're looking at languages that we're not necessarily familiar with. Is there an application, or what do you see the application of this machine learning and morphology for real life learning of these languages, or the knowledge about these, or how it might be applied to that sort of more touchy-feely side of linguistics?
Yeah. As with all these questions, this is not something I usually do, but I'll start off with sort of an anecdotal answer to your question. I mentioned my wife was doing computational linguistics, and she was a computational linguist at Microsoft Research when I was getting into this stuff. And it was no coincidence that I got into it, because I was really in the intellectual milieu that she and her colleagues were a part of. There was one year I was spending a quarter as a guest at Microsoft Research. And, you know, at the time in the 90s, I don't know if people listening to this will remember, but in the 90s, Microsoft was producing an encyclopedia called Encarta, and they sold it on CDs. And its biggest seller was an English version, but they were creating French and German and Dutch versions of Encarta. I don't know how many versions altogether they had. But at one point, there was a program manager who was in charge of all of the versions of Encarta that were not in English. And she came to the linguist group where my wife was, and she said, I'm wondering whether you've got morphologies for all these other languages that we are producing Encarta in, because when a person wants an article on, let's say, horses in Encarta, Encarta will look for not just the word horses, but also horse, and it'll do word stripping. It'll strip off affixes. And there was, and still is, a kind of an open source stemmer for English. And she said, we'd like to have something like this for the other languages that we use. So do you have morphologies for these other languages that you guys are working on? My wife was working on French, for example. And the answer that the linguist gave to the Encarta person was, well, we have them, but we can't give them to you, because they had purchased them with restrictions on the licensing that they had gotten, something like that. And they said, but John Goldsmith is over here. He's a visitor, and he's got something that'll, you know, you could use. So they sent her to me, and I said, oh yeah, that's exactly what I do. I've got this algorithm here. Give me Encarta, and I'll strip all the words. And she said, well, how long would it take? And I said, well, you get them to me, give them to me now, and I'll have them by noon. And she couldn't believe it. So that was sort of my anecdotal beginning. That was an application. And I've talked with people in the years since. I can't point to great practical successes, but there are things. In machine translation, for example, everybody, well, no, I was going to say everybody knows. It's not true that everybody knows, but a lot of people know that if you're going to do machine translation, it's best to split a word into the component morphemes, because it's the morpheme to morpheme connection that you want to learn first when you're doing machine translation. So I've had students who've worked on that. And ultimately, it would be great to use the kind of software that I'm developing for all sorts of practical tools, for speech recognition, for example, in low resource languages, for developing linguistic tools in low resources languages. So it keeps coming back to in low resource languages. It ought to be possible to use the kind of software that I'm interested in to get products that are of use to real people.
All right, thank you. And I think we do have time for that last question about the abstract concepts you mentioned. You mentioned in your email to me that your most recent work has been looking into abstract concepts behind expressed in language, for example, progressive aspects in English, which not all languages have, and so on. Could you tell us a little more about this?
Yeah, I think of it as channeling Benjamin Lee Whorf. I feel like it's the Whorf in me. And I got back into it recently because I was having bunch of conversations with my very first linguistics teacher, who was Lila Gleitman. And she's always been interested in the nature of thought and how it relates to language. And all the other people who work with her are equally interested in that. And these conversations that I was having with her and her colleagues really put me back in the mind where I was when I was first studying linguistics. And when I was a grad student at MIT, one of my good friends and classmates, his name was Eric Voiseschlager. He and I were really interested in the meaning, the semantics of concepts that are grammaticalized, but are very, very difficult to put your finger on. And at the time, I was studying Heidegger. And as I say, I was a grad student at MIT. There was a very famous mathematician, Giancarlo Rota. He passed away a bunch of years ago, but he was very interested in Heidegger. His math was largely in combinatorics. But I got interested in Heidegger and hanging out with him and listening to him. And Heidegger, certainly the early Heidegger, is all about trying to uncover the concepts that make our immediate life possible. And that's surely what the central morphemes and grammatical structures of language surely are based on those concepts that we need in order to make any sense of the world that we live in. So Eric Voiseschlager and I started working on a bunch of the concepts and the morphemes at the core of English. And I said a few minutes ago that I wasn't all that interested in phonology, and that's probably not true. I'm saying it a bit tongue-in-cheek, but the truth is what I really was interested in was this semantic stuff, because it seemed to me to, in the same way that Worf's work did, it seemed to promise a return to the world as a whole from linguistics in a way that almost nothing else that linguists could do would. If linguistics could really shed light on the fundamental concepts that we use in language, boy, that would be amazing. So Eric and I, in fact, published a paper on the semantics of the progressive, and we basically felt that, or we argued that to understand how English speakers use the progressive, you have to understand that we use the progressive when we are making a statement that's not about the structure of the world, but rather about what's observed. So we had examples like, one of the examples that I recall was imagining a town where there's let's imagine a statue of George Washington, and imagine two statements. The statue of George Washington stands at the corner of Lincoln and Congress Avenue. So it stands there, that's where it is. Contrast that with the statue of George Washington is standing at the corner of Congress and Lincoln. That second is the kind of unusual sentence that you might say if you were calling the police because you saw the statue out of place. You're saying what you see rather than what you know is the sort of the correct geography of the town that you live in. And in a wide range of cases, our understanding of the progressive versus non-progressive didn't have to do with time so much as with the progressive was used to describe what's observed but not understood, and the non-progressive was used to describe what's understood. And I think I didn't understand very well at the time, but what this work was challenging more than anything else was truth conditional semantics. And if I could go back and maybe split myself up and have several different careers in linguistics, I think I would try to have a career in which I said truth conditional semantics is not the right way to think about natural language, and that what we need to do is to develop an understanding of the semantic categories that people like Sapir and Worf were trying to get at, where they, I think, did a bad job, where Worf did a bad job, is he wasn't that interested in studying English in any detail. So he had a very peculiar idea about what the semantics was of English. I think primarily because he didn't think about it. He said, for example, that that English speakers see time as divided into a past, a present, and a future, whereas the grammar of English suggests anything but that. We don't have a three-way time system grammatically in English. So I was inspired by a lot of what Worf wrote. I think a lot of linguists, a lot of people who become linguists are really excited by Worf early on, and then they learn to forget about it, put away along with other childish things. And I would love to go back to that. Maybe I will. I don't know, but I get excited when I see other people who are interested in going beyond truth conditional semantics to better understand the concepts that we use in as we speak our native languages. And that's a side of language that generative grammarians in general have stayed away from completely. And that's too bad.
With that, I think that's all of our questions. It's been a tremendous honor having you here, and it's been brilliant to hear about a long and very varied career. So thank you for being with us. And it's been great to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.